From all indications, there were multiple shooters who fired dozens of shots, perhaps more than 50. Remarkably, all of those bullets missed a baby who was sitting in the car that was targeted.
Investigators remained at the scene well after nightfall at this corner littered with shell casings, where somehow a baby in this bullet-riddled car emerged unscathed.
On the afternoon of February 4th, 2026, 26-year-old mother Gabrielle Ayers was sitting inside a vehicle on the 7900 block of South May Street in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood of Chicago. With her in the car was Devin Draper, a 27-year-old man, and in the back seat, Ayers' 14-month-old daughter secured in a car seat. At approximately 1:25 p.m., according to the Chicago Police Department, 3 gunmen approached the vehicle and opened fire. Investigators later counted more than 50 shell casings scattered across the street. The sudden barrage shattered the car's windows and forced the vehicle to crash into a nearby van. Ayers was struck multiple times and later died from her injuries. Draper survived after being transported to the hospital with gunshot wounds. Inside the back seat, the infant remained physically unharmed. The gunmen fled before officers arrived. No suspects were immediately arrested. No clear motive was confirmed. As investigators began reconstructing the afternoon, different accounts of what happened began to raise new questions. Every case starts with evidence and works toward the truth. We rely on verified facts, documented timelines, and official records, not speculation or sensationalism. Subscribe to stay updated as we examine each case clearly, carefully, and professionally. According to the Chicago Police Department, the shooting involving Gabrielle Ayers occurred during the early afternoon of February 4th, 2026, on the 7900 block of South May Street in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood of Chicago. Police records indicate that officers were dispatched to the area at approximately 1:25 p.m. after multiple emergency calls reported a large number of gunshots. Responding officers arrived to find a vehicle that had sustained extensive gunfire damage and had subsequently collided with a nearby parked van. Inside the vehicle were 3 occupants. The driver was identified as Gabrielle Ayers, a 26-year-old woman. She had sustained multiple gunshot wounds and was transported to a hospital where she was later pronounced deceased. A second adult occupant, Devin Draper, age 27, had also been shot but survived the attack. He was transported for medical treatment and was listed in stable condition. In the rear seat of the vehicle was Ayers' infant daughter, secured in a child safety seat. The child was not physically injured during the incident. Crime scene technicians processed the location and recovered more than 50 spent shell casings scattered across the roadway and surrounding area. The volume of ballistic evidence suggested that multiple firearms had been discharged during the attack. The damaged vehicle contained numerous bullet impacts across the windshield, driver's side door, and front passenger area. Investigators also noted shattered glass and internal damage consistent with a sustained burst of gunfire. Preliminary findings suggested that 3 individuals approached the vehicle and began firing from outside the car. After discharging multiple rounds, the suspects fled the area before police arrived. Authorities initially described the incident as a targeted shooting, although the exact target was not confirmed at the time of the initial report. Detectives from the Chicago Police Department opened a homicide investigation. Officials stated that the motive had not been determined and that no suspects had been taken into custody during the early stages of the case. Prior to the shooting, Gabrielle Ayers was described by family members and acquaintances as a young mother managing work responsibilities while raising her child. At 26 years old, Ayers worked as a hairstylist and was known within her community on the south side of Chicago. Her schedule was reportedly centered on work appointments and caring for her daughter. Individuals familiar with Ayers stated that she spent most of her time balancing professional obligations with parenting responsibilities. Family members indicated that her daily routine generally involved traveling between home, work appointments, and visits with relatives or friends. Public statements from relatives suggested that Ayers did not appear to be involved in ongoing disputes or conflicts that would indicate a clear motive for a targeted attack. Because of this, investigators examining the case began considering another possibility, that the intended target may not have been Ayers herself. The fact that another adult was present in the vehicle during the shooting raised questions about whether the attack may have been directed towards someone else inside the car. This theory became one of several lines of inquiry explored during the early stages of the investigation. Law enforcement officials did not publicly confirm whether Devin Draper had any known conflicts or disputes that could have been connected to the shooting. However, investigators often evaluate the background and associations of all individuals present during a violent incident. In cases involving targeted shootings, determining the intended victim is often a critical step in identifying a motive. Because Ayers' infant daughter was present in the vehicle and unharmed, investigators also examined whether the shooters were aware that a child was inside the car at the time of the attack. No official statement clarified whether the attackers had knowledge of the child's presence. At the time of reporting, no individuals had been publicly identified as suspects in the killing of Gabriel Ayers. However, based on physical evidence and witness observations, investigators believe that 3 armed individuals were involved in the attack. According to the working theory developed by detectives, the suspects approached the vehicle while it was either stopped or moving slowly along the street. Evidence collected from the crime scene indicates that the gunman began firing almost immediately after reaching the vehicle. Ballistic evidence suggests that multiple firearms were used based on the number and type of shell casings recovered. The rapid succession of gunfire indicated that the shooters discharged numerous rounds within a short period of time. Investigators believe the entire attack likely lasted only a few seconds. The trajectory of the bullets indicated that most of the shots were directed toward the front portion of the vehicle, particularly the driver's area and the front passenger seat. After firing multiple rounds, the suspects reportedly left the area before emergency responders arrived. Because the suspects have not been identified, no statements or explanations from the individuals responsible for the shooting have been recorded. As a result, investigators must rely on physical evidence, surveillance footage, and witness accounts to reconstruct what occurred. Several investigative theories were considered during the early stages of the case. One possibility was retaliation related to a previous conflict involving someone connected to the vehicle's occupants. Targeted shootings in urban areas are sometimes linked to personal disputes or prior incidents. Another theory involved the possibility of mistaken identity. In such cases, attackers may believe they are targeting a specific individual, but mistakenly identify the wrong vehicle or occupants. A third theory considered by detectives was that the attack may have been a deliberate and pre-planned attempt to target one of the individuals inside the vehicle. Determining which of these scenarios, if any, accurately describes a motive requires identifying the suspects responsible for the shooting. Without arrests or statements from those involved, investigators continue to analyze available evidence. Surveillance cameras in the surrounding area may provide information about the suspect's movements before and after the shooting. Detectives also review nearby security footage to determine whether a vehicle was used by the attackers to approach or leave the scene. Witness statements collected from residents in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood may also help investigators establish a clearer timeline. However, as of the most recent updates, authorities have not publicly released the identities of any suspects or confirmed the motive behind the attack. The homicide investigation remains open until additional evidence leads to arrests. The events that led to the fatal shooting of Gabriel Ayers remain partially unresolved. Law enforcement officials continue to seek information from the public that can help identify the individuals responsible for the shooting and clarify the circumstances surrounding the incident. In the afternoon on February 4th, 2026, multiple residents in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood of Chicago reported auditory and visual observations linked to a shooting incident on the 7900 block of South May Street. Interviews collected by law enforcement and subsequently documented in case files indicated that several individuals residing or present near the immediate scene at approximately 1:25 p.m. heard a rapid sequence of loud sounds consistent with firearm discharge. Multiple witnesses described the same general auditory pattern, a series of rapid bursts resembling continuous popping. These descriptions were consistent across separate interviews, though the total number of sounds perceived varied among individuals. Some residents estimated hearing roughly 30 to 40 distinct sounds, while others described a longer sequence, suggesting more than 50 individual reports of shots fired. The variance in perceived counts reflected differences in proximity to the scene, individual attention to the sounds, and subjective interpretation of rapid gunfire. The pattern of the sounds, as described, suggested that multiple rounds were fired in less than a minute. The consensus among witnesses was that the duration of the gunfire was brief, occurring within a short time window rather than being spaced out over an extended period. In addition to auditory reports, several residents provided visual accounts of events immediately following the gunfire. A number of individuals reported seeing multiple people running away from the vicinity of the shooting. These individuals were described as moving quickly in different directions rather than in a single coordinated retreat. No specific descriptions of clothing, physical features, or identifiable characteristics were recorded in these initial witness statements. The accounts focused primarily on movement patterns. One subset of witnesses reported seeing a vehicle with shattered windows shortly after the loud sound stopped. In these observations, the vehicle was observed with extensive damage, including broken glass and visible perforations. The vehicle was noted in some accounts as having collided with another stationary object shortly after the gunfire, consistent with subsequent physical evidence documented at the scene. A consistent detail reported by multiple witnesses was the presence of a young child in the back seat of the vehicle at the time the gunfire ceased. In these accounts, the child was described as crying once the shooting ended. These observations were noted in several witness statements and later documented by responding officers who recorded the position and response of the infant at the time. Investigators secured the vehicle and cleared the scene. Despite general agreement on the timing of the gunfire and the presence of a damaged vehicle, witness accounts varied on the movement state of the vehicle at the exact moment the gunfire began. Some residents stated that the vehicle appeared to be in motion when the gunfire commenced. These accounts described the vehicle moving along the street, suggesting that the vehicle was either driving through the block or preparing to park. Other residents stated that the vehicle appeared to be stopped or slowing down near the curb when the shots were first heard. In these versions of events, the vehicle was either already slowed to a stop or decelerating as it prepared to park or engage with occupants on the sidewalk. These divergent accounts introduced uncertainty into the timeline reconstruction. In some cases, witnesses who lived on opposite sides of the street or at different angles relative to the scene reported conflicting impressions of the vehicle's movement state. As a result, investigators noted these inconsistencies in case files, indicating that witness perception of the vehicle's motion did not present a unified sequence of events. In total, witness statements provided a framework of observations that included the sound of rapid gunfire lasting a brief duration, reports of individuals moving away from the scene immediately after the gunfire, visual confirmation of a damaged vehicle with shattered windows soon after the incident, the presence and audible reaction of an infant inside the vehicle after the gunfire ended, inconsistent descriptions regarding the movement state of the vehicle at the onset of gunfire. While these accounts formed a significant portion of the factual record, the discrepancies in movement descriptions and the lack of specific suspect identification within witness testimonies necessitated further investigative processes to corroborate and reconcile the various elements of the witness's observations. Perspective: Detectives ***. Following the shooting incident on February 4th, 2026, detectives assigned to the case initiated formal investigative procedures designed to establish a coherent timeline, identify potential suspects, determine motive, and clarify the sequence of actions leading to and following the gunfire event. Detectives arrived at the crime scene subsequent to the initial response by patrol units. Their first priority was to secure the scene and coordinate the collection of physical evidence. This included establishing perimeter boundaries, identifying and preserving shell casings, photographing bullet impacts and vehicle damage, canvassing for additional witnesses not yet interviewed, preserving and cataloging evidence for forensic analysis. Detectives documented witness interviews conducted by patrol officers and supplemented these with additional follow-up interviews to clarify specific observational details. Investigators identified 3 central questions to guide their ongoing inquiry. Who was the intended target of the shooting? Detectives focused on identifying whether one or both occupants of the vehicle were known to any potential suspects, and whether either individual had any documented history of conflict or involvement in circumstances that could reasonably result in a targeted attack. Why were so many rounds fired? The volume of shots fired, documented in excess of 50 shell casings, suggested a high level of force applied in a short period of time. Detectives sought to determine whether this volume indicated multiple shooters, coordinated execution, or an attempt to ensure incapacitation. Did the attackers know the victims personally? Investigators pursued digital and personal history records to establish any potential connections between known associates of victims and individuals with documented involvement in violent activity. These questions structure the subsequent investigative processes. One of the occupants of the vehicle, identified as Devin Draper, survived gunshot wounds and was transported to a medical facility. Investigators categorized Draper as a critical witness due to his proximity to the incident and survival, which theoretically positioned him to provide first-hand information on pre-incident circumstances. Detectives obtained Draper's formal statement under conditions consistent with investigative protocol. However, the full details of his interview were not publicly released and were documented only in restricted case files. Factors potentially limiting public disclosure included ongoing identification of suspects, the potential for statements to compromise active investigative leads, legal considerations related to privacy or prospective prosecution. What is known from investigative notes is that Draper's account was expected to provide clarity on several elements: whether the occupants were followed immediately prior to the gunfire event, whether either occupant recognized any of the shooters, what actions or events directly preceded the discharge of firearms. Detectives sought to obtain surveillance footage from nearby residences and businesses to reconstruct movements leading up to the incident. Video data from fixed cameras in the vicinity was requested to determine the approach of any vehicles traveling in proximity to the victim's car prior to the shooting, the presence of individuals outside the vehicle moments before discharge began, the direction and manner in which potential shooters exited the scene after the gunfire. Investigators also executed legal processes to review digital records, including mobile phone location data for the vehicle occupants, communications history in the hours preceding the event, any digital footprints that could link potential suspects to the scene. These processes were integral to building a factual timeline that could be objectively cross-referenced with witness reports. Investigators flagged inconsistencies among witness statements as requiring careful analysis rather than dismissal. For example, conflicting accounts regarding whether the vehicle was moving or stationary at the onset of gunfire necessitated objective corroboration through physical evidence and surveillance analysis. Discrepancies in the number of shots perceived were examined in the context of ballistic ejection patterns and shell casing distribution. Detectives determined that human auditory perception under sudden high-stress conditions could account for variation in reported shot counts. Therefore, these discrepancies did not invalidate witness accounts, but indicated the need to rely on physical trace evidence for accurate quantification. In assessing whether the incident constituted a targeted attack, investigators examined prior law enforcement records for both vehicle occupants, any known associations with persons of interest in criminal activity, recent events in the community that could be linked to retaliation or conflict. To date, investigators had not publicly confirmed that either occupant was the intended target, indicating that any conclusion on the matter remains speculative within case notes. Perspective: crime scene evidence ***. Forensic analysis focused on the physical evidence documented at the scene of the shooting. This segment details the documented findings without interpretation beyond empirical observation. Crime scene technicians documented the collection of more than 50 shell casings distributed across the roadway. The casings were cataloged by location, orientation, and caliber markings. Key chain of custody procedures were observed to maintain evidentiary integrity. The distribution pattern of shell casings indicated multiple ejection points consistent with multiple shooters or the rapid discharge of multiple weapons. Each casing was inventoried and transported to a forensic laboratory for further analysis, including ballistic comparison, firing pin and extractor mark analysis, caliber determination. The subject vehicle exhibited multiple bullet impacts. Observations included numerous perforations in the driver's side window and frame, bullet strikes on the front passenger side window and door frame, interior damage to upholstery consistent with projectiles entering the cabin. Glass fragments and associated bullet fragments were retrieved and preserved for forensic comparison. Investigators conducted a documented trajectory analysis, identifying the approximate angles at which projectiles entered the vehicle. These analyses indicated that the majority of shots were directed toward the front portion of the vehicle, suggesting aim or focus on the front seat area rather than the rear seating area. The ballistic trajectory data suggested that most shots were fired at a relatively consistent height and angle, indicating that shooters were likely positioned at or near ground level relative to the vehicle. The distribution of entry points on the vehicle's exterior supported this determination. Forensic trajectory analysis also established that the child occupant in the back seat remained unharmed due to the concentration of fire toward the front portion of the vehicle. Preliminary examination of shell casings identified variations in caliber markings, suggesting the possible involvement of more than one type of firearm. Detailed forensic comparison was conducted to determine whether all shell casings could be matched to a single weapon model or multiple models. Analyze firing pin and breech face marks to associate specific casings with particular weapons if recovered. As of documented case files, no firearms have been publicly linked to the incident. The forensic evidence established the following objective facts. A large number of rounds were fired at the vehicle. Bullet impacts were concentrated toward the front sections of the vehicle. Multiple shell casings were recovered and cataloged. Trajectory and impact analyses indicated that the directionality of fire was consistent with shooters positioned outside and adjacent to the vehicle at the time of discharge. The initial public coverage of the February 4th, 2026 incident in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood of Chicago was dominated by a singular, dramatic detail. A baby survived more than 50 shots fired into a car. This detail became the focal point of nearly all mainstream media reports, forming the core narrative disseminated to the public. Headlines emphasized the infant's survival and the extraordinary volume of gunfire, capturing attention rapidly and shaping public perception. These reports correctly noted that a vehicle had been shot at in broad daylight, that over 50 rounds struck the car, that the driver and front seat passenger were shot, and that the infant in the back seat was unharmed. However, the public narrative simplified the complexity of the case into a single storyline centered on the child's survival. Other critical aspects received comparatively little attention. Who was the intended target of the shooting? Investigators considered whether the attack was directed at someone inside the vehicle other than the mother. What was the relationship between the victims and the assailants? Early investigative work examined possible connections to personal disputes, retaliation, or criminal networks. What broader circumstances preceded the attack? There were questions regarding why the vehicle was on that street at that specific time, and whether either adult in the car had any known conflicts. By focusing on the most dramatic detail, media coverage highlighted the immediate emotional impact of the event, while leaving many unanswered questions underreported. As of now, the case has not entered the courtroom because no suspect has been publicly identified or charged. Any discussion of courtroom proceedings remains hypothetical, contingent on arrests and subsequent legal action. If charges were filed, prosecutors will be tasked with establishing several critical points. Identity of the shooters. Investigators would need to provide evidence linking specific individuals to the crime scene through surveillance footage, forensic data, and witness testimony. Intentionality. The prosecution would argue that the gunman acted deliberately, as indicated by the volume of gunfire and the targeting of the vehicle. Establishing premeditation would be essential for first-degree murder or similar charges. Targeting of victims. Determining whether the attack was directed at the mother, the adult male passenger, or both will be central to proving motive. Defense attorneys in such cases typically challenge the reliability of eyewitness testimony, particularly when accounts vary on key details. Interpretations of ballistic evidence, including trajectories and firearm linkage. Identification evidence from surveillance or witness statements. Because arrests have not been made, these courtroom arguments remain theoretical, illustrating the complexity of translating investigative evidence into legal proceedings. The killing of Gabriel Ayers remains an open homicide investigation. Authorities continue to actively seek witness information, review surveillance footage, and gather tips that may lead to the identification of suspects. No arrests have been announced, and the timeline for potential legal resolution remains uncertain. Law enforcement continues to monitor leads while maintaining communication with the community to encourage cooperation. The case illustrates a gap between initial media coverage and the ongoing investigative work required to resolve complex urban homicides. Investigators continue to examine whether the attack was premeditated or connected to broader criminal activity. Without a confirmed motive, questions persist regarding the degree of planning involved and the possible intended target. Detectives are working to determine whether Gabriel Ayers or the adult male passenger was a primary target. Reconciling survivor accounts with physical evidence remains central to building a credible case. Residents remain uncertain about why such an attack occurred in broad daylight on a residential street. Questions about the perpetrator's escape, the timing of the attack, and the risk to bystanders remain points of concern. Questions persist regarding how 3 gunmen could fire over 50 rounds at a vehicle and escape without immediate identification. These concerns reflect broader anxieties about urban crime dynamics and law enforcement capacity. Despite detailed reporting on the mechanics of the attack, the number of shots fired, the condition of the occupants, and the survival of the infant, a central question remains unresolved. Why did multiple gunmen fire more than 50 rounds at a car carrying a mother and her child in the middle of the afternoon in Chicago? This question highlights the gap between the public media narrative and the ongoing investigative reality. While the child's survival captured public attention, the motivation behind the attack, the intended targets, and the identities of the shooters remain unknown, making this facts verified, case concluded. Justice is determined by what can be proven. Subscribe for more documented cases and real criminal investigations.